Hello, history class. I am back on the mic again, so to speak, going over our review on Republican ascendancy and challenges. So, PowerPoint question number one, what problems might Jefferson's version of government lead to? Of course, Thomas Jefferson had this very unique vision of government really being run by a society of small independent landowners. And certainly going back to a much more limited version of government than, say, the Federalists had under John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, who were certainly much more interested in a much stronger centralized government, more impact on economics, and more of a role in coordinating the various states. Jefferson certainly wanted to go back to something much more similar, I would say, to something like the Articles of Confederation, with the federal government having very, very limited power and pretty much its main functions, kind of running the bare minimums of necessity of what needs to be done, like you saw in the one PowerPoint slide, manning lighthouses, conducting postal services, implementing some sort of trade policy, but not doing a whole heck of a lot more than that. You certainly see that with him pretty much making the military very, very small, same way with the Navy, and not having a lot of support for the country's economic systems or economic infrastructure, because he really thought that the best economic infrastructure would be a lot of people simply owning land and working land. Of course, his vision was very much tied to the idea of white land ownership. Of course, he was a slave owner himself, and being from the South, he really wanted to try to replicate the success, that economic success of white Southern planters, wealthy white Southern planters across the United States, which, being a wealthy white Southern planter himself, made a lot of sense. Of course, the problem was slavery and the agricultural systems in the South weren't going to work in the North. The culture, the geography, the climate, none of that was going to be conducive to making the same kind of economic system which was viable in Virginia and the Carolinas, in Georgia, making those viable in the northern states, which were much more reliant upon industry, upon trade, upon commerce, upon manufacturing than the southern states. So certainly Jefferson's version was going to be much more advantageous to the portions of the country which did not need as much federal investment, and less advantageous to the sections of the economy and of the country that felt like they did. And a lot of the same problems that you end up seeing with the Articles of Confederation, you end up seeing popping up throughout Jefferson's administration as well. The fact that the federal government did not have a strong international presence, did not have a strong army to protect shipping and trading rights, that ultimately becomes a pretty large problem for Thomas Jefferson and his administration, as well as the fact that it was relatively hard to form a cohesive government between the states based upon a very, very weak federal government. But this was certainly a different time, as our picture here really indicates. If you can look at Washington, D.C. today and look at Washington, D.C. in this picture here, a very different time. And Washington at this point in time was still a very kind of almost small town, you might think of. And that really it was an economic idea, an economic philosophy, which suited well Thomas Jefferson from kind of his own perspective and his traditions coming from Virginia as a wealthy white Southern planter, but certainly was not going to be an economic model that was going to be beneficial to many people in the North, and certainly not beneficial to anyone who might have been enslaved, an American Indian. Of course, a big push from Thomas Jefferson was increasingly acquiring more land in order to spread this white land ownership, and oftentimes that was going to be coming increasingly at the expense of American Indian groups. And certainly this was a policy that was going to be taken up by people after Thomas Jefferson, by future presidents, and was going to be continued upon. Of course, looking at the Louisiana Purchase, that quite possibly might be Thomas Jefferson's greatest contribution towards this idea of large, widespread land ownership, as he purchased and won kind of fell swoop, more land acquired for the United States than really at any other point in time in our history. Pretty much most of the land between the Mississippi River and the Pacific coast was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase for an insanely cheap amount of money. For the amount of land we got, Napoleon was certainly much more interested in acquiring the money and the funds than the land itself, and Thomas Jefferson really ends up benefiting from this in the Louisiana Purchase. So looking at the important aspects of the Lewis and Clark expedition when they go out to survey, pretty much take an inventory of what the United States had acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. A lot of you had some very good thoughts on this, taking a look at the fact that a lot of these Great Plains American Indian groups that had not had contact with the United States government prior to this point in time, those relations are established. And certainly for a certain amount of time, this was a mutually beneficial arrangement, as many of these Plain Indians groups did not have the same access to trade with European groups that the more eastern tribes had had prior to this, and were eager to come into contact with some of those same advantages of firearms, of iron materials, and so forth that their neighbors had that oftentimes got traded into these Plains Indian groups, but they did not have the direct access to them, as well as the fact that there were American business interests, such as John Jacob Astor, which are very interested in establishing these trade relations with the Plains and Mountain Indian groups that had not existed prior to this point in time. But of course, as time goes on, increasingly, Thomas Jefferson's really vision and those who followed after it of land ownership for white Americans came to dominate. And one of the processes, of course, that we see is the continual pushing westward of American Indian groups to the Mississippi River, eventually past the Mississippi River. And then, of course, after the time period of the Civil War, you start seeing American Indian groups being confined to smaller and smaller locations on land that was not desirable to essentially white Americans through the process of war, unequal treaties, and so forth. Getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but certainly this is the first kind of contact and touching point between those two groups, which, like I said, may start out relatively mutually beneficial at the beginning, but ultimately has some relatively disastrous effects on these American Indian groups as time progresses and the United States government extends its reach farther and farther westward. Simply, a lot of people point out the fact that the Lewis and Clark expedition just, settling the border disputes between France and Spain, and just taking an inventory of the great diversity of land that the United States now controlled, what's in the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Coast, big river systems such as the Columbian River and the Missouri River. Really the kind of inventory of what the United States and the diversity that the government itself, of course, now owned. And of course, when I'm talking about land ownership, I am talking about kind of the lines on the map. As certainly there were the vast majority of people who were still living on this land were the American Indians, who, from their perspective, certainly still owned this land. And that the process of the United States actually pretty much taking control of it is a completely separate issue. But certainly from that viewpoint, in that respect, you see a large deal of importance. But pretty much the entire idea, which developed shortly after this time, and which we'll be talking about in future classes, of manifest destiny, is also, I'd say, very, very important, and is able to be articulated with the Lewis and Clark expedition in its beginnings. This idea that the United States now has the ability to expand from coast to coast, and this push for white land ownership and white land control is going to go along with that. And as I said, oftentimes this is going to be coming, of course, at the expense of the people who are actually still living there, the American Indian groups. But this entire process of seeing this land that was eventually going to become the United States, and the push then to actually go out and start exerting direct control over it and promoting more, like I said, white land ownership and utilization of the land, whether it's through agriculture and farming, whether it's through timber, whether it's through mining. All of those will eventually come along with this as well as it gets pushed farther and farther out. But all that begins here with Lewis and Clark and their inventory of all these natural resources, which the United States, through Thomas Jefferson, had now essentially purchased in one sense from the French, but still really had to find various ways to take control of it from the people who had been living there for generations and thousands of years, the American Indians. So part of question number 2, why were these crises, particularly talking about the British and the French not respecting the United States, not respecting their shipping rights, not respecting their sailors, and how were they made worse by Thomas Jefferson's policies and political philosophy, particularly the very disastrous embargoes and trading restrictions that he tried to implement on France and Great Britain. The main problem being that neither side really cared. They were fine doing business with the United States, but neither of them were dependent upon it, and they were much more interested and concerned with combating and fighting each other and making sure that the other side was not going to be benefiting with trade from the United States than they were the fact that Jefferson wanted to cut off or limit trade with them. So Jefferson's economic leverage really never ends up working this conflict. As much as he does not want to get involved, of course, the United States is increasingly kind of involved in skirmishes with both sides, and none of them ultimately end up very well for the United States, and ultimately ends up becoming more of an embarrassment than anything. The fact that through his policies of really having a very limited government, very limited military, and so forth, he was really unable to impact and influence in foreign policy in any meaningful way, because France and Great Britain were pretty much able to just completely ignore his demands, and most of his policies ended up only hurting the business interests and commercial interests of the United States anyways, and had very little impact on France or Great Britain. So despite the risks, why do you think President Madison agreed to declare war? Certainly the war hawks had a huge role to play in this. Now they had really kind of taken control of the Jeffersonian Republican Democratic Party. Of course, very confusing. Eventually, this party is going to go on to become just the Democrat or the Democratic Party as we get forward in class towards the Civil War. But that really, in order for Madison to continue to be the figurehead of his party, making common cause with the kind of younger generation who was coming in, who was eager to try to repeat some of the successes and the glory of the Revolutionary War, was a way for him to do this. And there was always this idea in the United States and this goal of trying to, claim Canada and get, the full extent of North America pretty much under the control of the United States. And that was kind of a big object for them. Of course, this ends up failing relatively miserably. The United States never gets even close to taking Canada throughout the war. But certainly the goal of trying to send a strong message as well on an international stage to Great Britain to stop impressing our soldiers, leave our economic interests alone, because you could potentially have very negative side effects from that through war in your holdings you do still have in North America, came along with that. And all these things kind of went together, but still, with the relatively, I would say, weak position the United States was in, it was a very big risk that, going to war with Great Britain once again. And of course, what you ultimately end up seeing happening is that neither side really gains a whole lot through this conflict or through the war. Of course, General Perry there with one of the victories that the United States is able to have, taking the Great Lakes, and really is allow them to not lose any territory, at least to Great Britain through the conflict. So question number 5, what historical, ideological, and political factors do you think went into the formation of the Monroe Doctrine? So I think really you can look back to the initial French Revolution here and the fighting between France and the European powers, and with George Washington and his following presidents really choosing to stay out of European policies and European fighting and not wanting to choose side, wanting to maintain open trading relationships with both sides. So simply the Monroe Doctrine was kind of an articulation from the United States' involvement in Europe in what was already taking place. The United States throughout the 1800s becomes much more interested in consolidation, in expanding into the land of the Louisiana Purchase up to the Mississippi River, and that domestic expansion was much more in the mindset of the United States than external expansion. That being said, they certainly wanted to, in some ways, support other American countries, Latin American, Central American, Caribbean American, who were eager to replicate their success in throwing off European control, while at the same time kind of maintaining themselves as sort of the leader in this process and the most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, as time goes on, the Monroe Doctrine becomes a very different connotation to it. At this point in time, it was still relatively trying to be protective to those other American, North and South American countries that were trying to break free from European rule. As time goes on, the Monroe Doctrine really becomes an argument for the United States to have the right to enforce their own control and their own hegemony over the Americas, and that they should be the ones who are essentially exploiting those areas for their own gain. Of course, this is going to come in more of kind of the era of new imperialism in the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, and the early 1900s. And that the Monroe Doctrine at that point in time is pretty much going to be the United States saying, we are going to be the ones exploiting Central and South America, European powers, you stay out of it. But at this point in time, it was still essentially the United States saying that this is our territory, and these people should have the same right to engage in the same revolutionary process that we did without direct interference from Europeans. And our part will be that we will not be interfering in the politics and the policies of Europe. Of course, that was something that the United States was already doing, so it's not really like the United States was giving up anything in this bargain. But they certainly wanted to articulate to European powers that the countries that had declared independence in the Americas should stay that way themselves, and those other countries in Central and South America who had already done so as well. But certainly I would say the foreign policy that you see operating by the United States throughout the entire 1800s is developed here with the Monroe Doctrine, and it's much more isolationist and it's much more internal looking, and wanting to insulate itself to a large degree from Europe rather than engage with Europe, at least politically. And this really doesn't change until you get up to the time period of the Spanish-American War and American expansionism, as well as, of course, the First World War is the real big breaking point with the Monroe Doctrine, as the United States actually directly enters into a European conflict in Europe. But up until that point in time, the Monroe Doctrine has a very important role in defining the United States' role within the world and foreign policy moving forward. So just real briefly going over the discussion documents, I thought everyone did a really good job this week looking at these documents. I was very happy that you brought in a lot of good examples. And of course, if you got a grade that you did not expect or did not understand, please let me know, contact me, and I will give you a full detail of how and why I arrived at your grades. But I also thought you did a very good job talking back and forth with one another through this document as well. So looking at Eli Whitney and Thomas Jefferson letters, the cotton gin is going to go on to have a very instrumental impact on the role that slavery takes in the United States. And we're going to see this in the coming weeks. Prior to this point in time, a lot of people thought that slavery was actually going to be kind of going away by itself after the Revolution. And that's one of the reasons why it was not necessarily tackled harder in the formation of the Constitution. A lot of people kind of thought it was going to be going away, that it was becoming less and less profitable. Tobacco prices had been dropping. Of course, tobacco at that point in time was still the primary crop on these large plantation systems. But the cotton gin ends up coming along at just the right time, making a ginormous economic impact. And we'll be talking about this more next week, but it coincided with the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And one of the first industries which became industrialized was the clothing industry or the cloth industry. And that meant an insatiable demand for cotton. And because cotton was very difficult to pick and to process, in particular by hand, because it had a lot of seeds in it that you had to pick out individually, that a machine in the form of the Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which was able to remove a lot of these seeds and a lot of these impurities from the cotton at a very rapid pace, has a tremendous impact on the amount of cotton and the profitability of cotton within the United States. And that completely reinvigorates the slave system within the United States, because now cotton becomes incredibly profitable, and a lot of these plantations that had been surviving off of tobacco and these other plantation crops we've been talking about, switch over to cotton and begin making massive amounts of profit, and that the more land and the more slaves that one can own, the more profit that one can make very quickly off of cotton. And this really is what re-intensifies the slave system and creates, re-intensifies the division between the northern states and the southern states, and starts creating more divisions as we move towards the Civil War period, because the entire slave system becomes much more intensified after the creation of the cotton gin and the massive amounts of profits that are being made here. And by the time you get up to the 1840s, 1850s, it's somewhere between like 70 and 80% of the exports from the United States are actually in the form of cotton. So a massive amount of international impact is being had here by this system as well. But it's very interesting to look at these very early documents here where neither Eli Whitney or Thomas Jefferson could certainly see this. And we're really just looking at the basic invention by itself. And I think you get a relatively interesting idea of both of them. Eli Whitney really talking about the benefits of it that you eventually see being very, very true. That if turned with horses or by water, 2 persons will clean as much cotton in one day as 100 persons could clean in the same time. Very, very true. The fact that this ultimately is what made cotton production very possible, because it would take 2 people the same amount of work as it would take 100 people in the same amount of time. The cotton contains fewer broken seeds and impurities, and is said to be more valuable than cotton which is cleaned in the usual way. Yep, once more, very, very true, and doing a good job of really promoting why his product here, cotton gin, which is of course short for cotton engine, ultimately ends up becoming very, very widely used, very profitable itself, and ultimately ends up having this very drastic impact on society. Thomas Jefferson, from his standpoint, his point of view, certainly seems to be coming at it from the point of a business owner, right? Wanting to know the basics. Has it been tested out, or is this just theoretical? How much cotton can it clean, and how quickly? And of course, what is the cost going to be? But it's very interesting early on, I would say, this quote that he has, where, as the state of Virginia, of which I am, carries on household manufactures of cotton to a great extent, as I do myself, and one of our great embarrassments in the cleaning of cotton of the seed. So kind of saying that it's very, very difficult to do at this point in time, and expressing a lot of interest in how this can change it. Of course, it's very important to note that when he says for household use, or that I do myself, he's really talking about what he's having his slaves do. This is not Thomas Jefferson out in his field picking and removing cotton impurities himself. He is using this pretty much as language for what he is going to be having slaves do. And by household manufacturing, he's really talking about plantation manufacturing here. So make sure you keep that in mind through this time period as well. As like I said, with the increase of the cotton gin and the productivity and the valuable nature of cotton, the need for more and more slaves and more intense slave labor only increases. And along with that, you see once more a reinvigoration of the justifications for slavery on the part of slave owners. And eventually, when there's a rise in the abolition movement in the North, it creates a great division within this country, which is eventually going to propel it into, of course, the Civil War time period, which we'll be talking about in just a few weeks here. Looking at Anne Royall's document, you also see really another aspect that we talked about this week, and that was the increasing removal of American Indians from their land, particularly in lands that are valuable for white land ownership. And we see that taking place here in Alabama. Of course, this is shortly after the War of 1812, and as time goes on, this is relatively shortly before the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, as between really the 1820s and the Revolutionary War, you see an increased emphasis to push American Indian groups from between the Appalachian Mountains past the Mississippi River, particularly in these very valuable locations such as Alabama, which of course very important for fruit at this point in time. She does a great job kind of describing the bounty and all the peaches and the apples and so forth within the landscape, and eventually it's going to become very, very important and very wealthy for cotton and plantation owners as well. And a very interesting aspect how she is talking about the relationship between whites, American Indians, and slaves as well, talking about the figure of John Melton, how he had an American Indian wife, but he was a slave owner himself. And that was still seen, that American Indians or, were able to own slaves and were trying to really, in a lot of ways, do everything that white culture was doing. White culture was telling them to do, but even though essentially they were doing everything white, living in a very Euro-American lifestyle with their agriculture, with their homes, even to the fact of purchasing and using slaves, that was not enough, and that if white Americans could find a way to push her or pressure them off of the land, that they were going to be doing that, and that no amount of quote unquote assimilation that American Indian groups could do was going to prevent that from happening. And that's one of the things you see happening. It was never a problem of American Indians having a problem with assimilating. It was the problem that even if they did assimilate, white Americans were going to be coming in and finding a way to get the land from them regardless. And the way they were doing this was oftentimes through the state or the federal government having their backing and increasingly pushing American Indian groups farther and farther west. And you certainly see the beginnings of it here with Anne Royal and kind of her account. But certainly you can see why eventually Alabama becomes such an important economic portion of the southern states of the United States. Very important in the fruit production, but increasingly more so in cotton production as well, and becomes once more just kind of ingrained in the same way that other southern states had into this same plantation system and the exact same kind of social stratified society in the same way, with an expansion of slavery and the removal of American Indians in those territories as well. And very similar, like other locations in the South, it was going to be typified by very wealthy elite landowners owning the land. They're really the ones behind this increase of grabbing land, and that the majority of the population, the majority of the white population, was not going to be slave owners. But they were certainly going to be not nearly as successful as those who were slave owners, and were essentially going to be just kind of living off of the system in a very kind of unequal society, which is going to be dominated by those wealthy individuals who could own slaves, who could own the orchards, who could own the plantations. But that because of a lot of those issues we talked about earlier, the development and the integration of racism into the society, the white individuals who were not really benefiting, and oftentimes the non-plantation owning whites in the South were much poorer than those who were living in the North, which was much more industrialized, a lot more manufacturing and so forth, a lot larger free market developed in the North as opposed to the South. And a lot of times, non-wealthy whites were impacted by this very, very poorly as well. So I think it's important to not overlook that aspect as well. And the importance of that will become more and more clear as we move towards the Civil War as well. So those are my thoughts on the questions from this week. As usual, if you have any questions about your grade, your grade for the class, your grade for the PowerPoints or the discussion questions, feel free to let me know. And I hope you all have a great week coming up here. Thank you.